In this short video, we're going to learn how to find the cost minimizing choices of labor and capital when we have a perfect substitutes production function. Let's imagine that Handwoven Creations, a firm that produces decorative baskets, has a production function given by the following: 4 times L plus 8K, where L is hours of labor hired and K is hours of capital. The firm wants to produce 160 baskets. The current wage is $10 an hour, and the price of capital is $50 an hour. Our goal is to find how many units of labor and capital the firm should hire in order to minimize their costs. What do we need to know in order to solve this question? We need a production function, an output goal, and input prices for labor and for capital. How should we go about solving this question? Well, this kind of production function is linear, which means the isoquants are also going to be lines. That means that we can't be looking for a tangency condition. Instead, we want to compare the marginal product of labor over the wage to the marginal product of capital over the rent. These are essentially like the additional production per dollar spent on labor and the additional production per dollar spent on capital. And what do we do once we compare them? Well, if we find that the marginal product of labor over the wage is greater than the marginal product of capital over the rent, we should conclude that per dollar spent on labor, we're getting more production than dollar spent on capital, which means we should hire only labor. And how much labor do we hire? Enough to satisfy the isoquant condition. So we hire enough to produce 160 baskets, and capital is equal to 0. If the opposite is true and the marginal product of labor over the wage is less than the marginal product of capital over the rent, that means that we're getting more output per dollar spent on capital, and we should hire only capital. In this case, we conclude labor is 0 and capital is hired until we are able to produce 160 baskets. There's one last possibility that we need to talk about. If these two ratios are equal to each other, that actually means that the slope of the isoquant is exactly equal to the slope of the isocost lines. In that case, the tangency condition holds everywhere. We can't say what basket is optimal. We can just say that any input choice that meets the isoquant condition, meaning that produces 160 baskets, is optimal. It's time for us to solve this question. Here's what we know. We know the production function is 4L plus 8K. We know the wage is 10 and the rent is 50. And the firm's goal is to produce 160 baskets. What are we looking for? We're trying to find the cost minimizing choice of labor and capital. Because this is a perfect substitutes production function, we're going to start by computing the marginal products and then comparing those ratios. So the marginal product of labor is equal to the partial derivative of the production function with respect to L, which is 4. And the marginal product of capital is equal to the partial with respect to K, which is 8. From there, we can compute the relevant ratios. So for labor, we have the marginal product of labor over the wage, which is equal to 4 over 10, or 4. And for capital, we have the marginal product of capital over the rent, which is equal to 8 over 50. Well, we can do a little bit of simplification here. Actually, I think what I'm going to do is not to say this is equal to 4, but instead, so that I can compare them, I'm going to convert them to be both out of 100. So for my marginal product of labor over the wage, I'm going to multiply that fraction top and bottom by 10. And I'm going to get 40 over 100. And for my marginal product of capital over the rent, I'm going to multiply it top and bottom by 2. And I'm going to write this as 16 over 100. Now, it's quite easy to successfully compare these two ratios. 40 over 100 is larger than 16 over 100. That means that the marginal product of labor over the wage is greater than the marginal product of capital over the rent. The conclusion is we're going to hire only L, because every dollar we spend on labor generates more additional output than every dollar spent on capital. So since we know we're going to hire only labor, first thing we're going to write down is that capital is equal to 0. We know that for sure. Now we need to figure out how much labor we're actually going to hire. And to do that, we're going to go to that isoquant condition, or if you prefer, production constraint. In this question, we are told that we must produce 160 baskets. That's our firm's goal. So we write down the isoquant condition, 4L plus 8K equals 160, and then we start filling in what we know. In particular, we're going to substitute 1 into 2 so that we can find the amount of labor that needs to be hired in order to produce 160 baskets. So I have 4L plus 8 times 0 is equal to 160. Solving for L, I get L is equal to 160 divided by 4, or L is equal to 40. So using those ratios of marginal product of labor over wage, comparing it to the marginal product of capital over the rent, we identified that only labor should be used. Once we knew that, we wrote down that isoquant condition and we said to ourselves, what has to be true? We need to produce 160 units. And then we figured out how much labor we had to hire in order to do so. Finally, we've concluded that the cost minimizing input choices are 40 units of labor and 0 units of capital.